So far in the series, we've mostly focused on crafting functional features, classes that we can use to make different kind of actions within the game. However, the game itself pretty much looks like nothing because we don't have any user interface for it yet. We do have a few components, but that doesn't make a game. This episode is focused on learning how to use a few tools which are very useful to make any kind of user interface, any kind of basic user interface at least. If you have complex ideas, of course you will need to work a little bit more and eventually need other nodes than the one that I will present to you today. But these really can handle pretty much anything basic. If you do want more in-depth UI tutorials, I suggest you to go watch the UI tutorial video, which is somewhere in the past. Otherwise, let's go with what we will use in this video. First, I want to talk about containers. Containers are an extension of control nodes, which you can find in the green nodes of Godot, and they do act as nodes which allows you to arrange and size other control nodes. So they are containers. They have a few important things. They expand to make space for their children very often, and they position their children based on their settings. So this is kind of a broad statement because every container is unique in its way of managing these two lines. And sometimes, they will expand differently. There is another thing which is very important with containers. Containers can have a default size or minimum size which can be allocated to children to help organizing children. Basically, what I want you to get and understand is that containers can either be, not have their initial space and then expand based on what the children want, but they can also go backward by actually having a dedicated space, allocating that space to its children. The second thing which will help you understand this better, children have settings which matter when it comes to organizing them within containers. Children will communicate the space they need based on their size or minimum size, which will cause the container to expand if needed. Children can communicate their need to use available space. Containers may or may not have that space to allocate to those children. So what it means is basically children can ask to the container, give me the free space you have, which is not taken by anyone. And then whether or not there is space, the container will or will not expand the child. Here I did list a few very important containers that you will be using a lot in basic UI. The first two VBox and HBox containers are very useful because they actually allow you to line different objects in a vertical or horizontal list. An actual example is, look at this container types box here. It is one entire box, which is divided vertically to have a smaller box on the left, a smaller box on the right. Then those two smaller boxes are again divided, this time 1, 2, 3 times vertically to have 1, 2, 3 nodes. And the second block is divided twice to have 1 node, 2 node, and a little bit of extra space at the bottom. This is pretty much how those two nodes work. The 3 other nodes which are very important are scroll container. Scroll container combined with other containers allows you to create virtually infinite space by creating space outside of the size which is allocated to the container while allowing to still see whatever is within by scrolling, right? That's pretty intuitive. Tab container is slightly different. It allows you to switch the view from one container to another. So it's like changing the view, changing the page and going from one page to another. Tab containers show only one child at the same time. This is very cool, for example, when you have a main view with your clickers, your generators, and you actually want another view for your factory, your upgrades, or your inventory, then this is where tab containers will come into play. Margin container is the last container that you will use a lot. This will create a space around its child. Very useful in many situations because it allows you to make sure that, for example, here, those boxes do not directly stick to the edges or the walls of the parent container. They have a little bit more space to breathe, and this is important. Enough theory, let's go back to Godot and actually make a little bit of user interface. So I won't spend hours making a complete game here. What I want to give you is the tools that you will be able to use in order to create whatever user interface you want. Let's just start by getting rid of whatever we had created before because those components will not be necessary. And I actually want to organize this game scene a little bit better by creating a singleton node and smash all my singletons in there. And I will create an entirely new scene, which is going to be the user interface. So let's rename this user interface. By default, it takes the entire screen with the full rectangle anchor. So that is great. And what we will do to show you a few things is recreating a user interface inspired by the game Magic Research. What we will do is a navigator on the left, a left panel here, which will have the buttons which change the view, the main view, which will be here. And we will have a few resources label at the bottom. In order to do that, we will use vertical and horizontal box containers, which will allow us to divide the space of the screen. Let's actually create a horizontal box container in there. And we will allocate the entire space available to that container. We will create two children here, the left panel, which will have a defined size, and the main view on the right, which will take all the available space. Let's create two control nodes, which are going to be left panel and main view. Now let's size those children. In order to notify the container what is the space we need, we go in the layout and either set a direct size, which doesn't work here because it is controlled by the container. So instead, what we will do is say what custom minimum size we want. Here we will use a minimum width of 240 pixels for the left panel. The right panel or main view, we will actually not calculate whatever this distance is. Doesn't make sense. Even more since every player may have a different size for their screen, so we don't know what the size that we need is going to be. Fortunately, we do have features for that which are in the layout. We can go in the container sizing and choose to expand horizontally. So this is what I meant when I said that children can ask for free space to expand when they want to. Alright, Here, let's actually fill this left panel a little bit. What we will do is separate this left panel in two areas. The first area at the top will be the navigator with different buttons, which can change the content on the view on the right. At the bottom, we will add different labels which display the resources we have, this kind of things. Let's change this left panel to a vertical box container. Well, not creating it, change type to VBox. And this VBox, we will create again two control nodes, which are going to be the navigator and the resources. Here is another interesting behavior of children expanding in a container. If several children are trying to expand and are asking for space, the container will allocate the space evenly. So now we do have half of the vertical space for the resources and half for the navigator. We can change this by changing the stretch ratios, but here half is very decent. I said that the top part would be a scroll container. Well, sorry, I did not mean that. The top part is a navigation button list. But we actually want to consider that we may have so many buttons that it doesn't fit. So instead of making the buttons smaller, we will add a scroll view. Let's change this navigator here into a scroll container. The scroll container is taking the entire space and it requires one child, which here is going to be another container. So we will have a vertical box container like this, and we will go in the layout and we will expand this container on both sides or directions so that it takes the entire place. Now all we have to do is just throw some buttons in there, assign a minimum size for the button, which is going to be 80 pixel height, and the width is going to be stretching. And we will put just something like view 1, duplicate this button, and the second one will have view 2. Okay. The thing is that we can now duplicate those buttons as much as we want, and if we do exceed, you see that we have this scrolling view. Let's save this scene so that we can try it. In the scene's user interface, we save it, and we try the scene. As you can see, we are scrolling through the buttons. It's working very fine. There are a few settings which you can use for the scroll view. You can change how you want the scroll to work, if you want scroll bars, this kind of things. And also, if you want, for example, to have the buttons to stick together, you can choose in the VBox container to change the theme override constant of separation to 0. So this way, there's not going to be any separation. Let's get rid of extra buttons because for this example, I only need 2. And let's ignore this resource panel here. You will perfectly be able to add things in there. Let's actually think about the margin container. Here, let's admit you don't want your buttons to be sticking to the edges of the scroll view. What you will do instead is create a margin container between your scroll container and your VBox container. So you put the VBox inside the margin, You make sure that your margin is correctly expanding to take the entire space. Now that the margin is correctly sized, again you can go in the theme overrides constants and change the amount of pixels you want of margin on each size. So let's have 8 pixel margin on each size. Here, there it is. We have 8 pixels of difference between the button and the edges. Okay. Let's talk about the main view now. The main view, which is right there, will be a tab container. So let's change the type to a tab container. And as you can see, the first thing that we see is that there is a panel style to it. We can completely get rid of this by changing this entire theme of the game. However, this is not what we will be doing in this video. Theme and skinning will come in another episode. Instead, we will remove this manually by watching themes overrides. In the theme overrides, we can go in the styles and override the panel style, right, which is what we see here. Create a new style box, flat, and simply bring the opacity to 0, so that whatever panel is behind this tab container, we don't see it anymore, it's transparent. This is the first thing. What we will do now is create 2 different views, so those are just going to be 2 control nodes, which are representing views. We will have a control node, which is going to be view 1, and a control node, which is going to be view 2. Let's add a label within those 2 views, center the label and say view 1. And for the second label, it's going to be view 2. So I'm just gonna paste it. Nope. Copy. Paste. Alright. And second label is going to be view 2. Now, if I do go in my tab container, scroll through its properties, and change the current tab to 0, well, from 0 to 1, we move from view 1 to view 2, which is visible on the tabs here, and visible here as well because the label is showing. You can also note that in the scene tree, you have someone hiding and someone visible. So this is how you change the views, by changing this property here, which is what we will do very soon. But first, let's actually take care of these 2 little guys here. If you actually want those tabs to stay, well, you can use those, right? You don't have to create necessarily those buttons. You can use tabs, built-in tabs. However, here, since we are creating buttons on the left, we will get rid of those. It's actually very easy. You just uncheck tabs visible and they're gone. All right. Now that we have all this, I will actually link those buttons because we do have 2 buttons here and we want them to change the content of the view. There are many different ways to do that, so I'm just gonna show you one, and it works, right? This is what we ask for, but you can definitely think about making another one if you have something that suits your game better. This will start by creating a script for the user interface, which will be a user interface singleton. The singleton is ready. So what we're gonna do is basically grab this main view here, get an access to it, and we will create a method that will change the value of the current tab ID. by using onReady, we will grab this main view node, which is a tab container, and we will use a unique node access. You right click and access as unique name to create this percent icon here. And what it does basically is that it creates a unique access within the scene. So it doesn't work outside of the scene. Game here cannot use the unique access of main view. It doesn't work. But user interface can, because they share the same scene. It is very useful because you can now get the node without having to type the path from the node that you are fetching from, but you just need the name since it is unique. So here we will just get node of percent main view. Another way to set that is saying equal to percent main view. However, I want to show the getNode method because this is more understandable. Now that we have this, we actually will create a request that other entities can call upon. This is going to be change view, and it will require an index as an integer. We will return an error. And now let's see how we can fill this little thing here. The main view, if we go check the documentation of it, we do have the current tab property, which is what we will change to display a different view. However, we do have as well the method getTabCount, which returns the number of tabs. This is going to be important to make sure that the index that we try to access is correctly within the bounds of the tab container that we are changing. So what I want to do very first is check that the index that I want to apply to my tab container is correctly within the bound. So if the index is inferior to 0, or if the index is superior or equal to the amount of tabs, then we want to return an error. So main view dot get tab count. The reason why it is superior or equal to the main tab count is because there is a slight difference between the index and the size. The size begins at 1 and goes to the maximum size to count. Meanwhile, the index begins at 0 and it goes from 0 to the count -1. This is a very common system that you find in pretty much all the languages, at least all the languages I've used. So yeah, something you will see very much. Now that we do know that we are correctly within the bounds of the tab container, we just need to change main view dot current tab to match with the index that we created or we received. This is all we will need at the moment for this user interface singleton. What we need is to connect those two buttons to this method with the correct ID within it. So there are many ways to do that again. You can create one script per button, which eventually on a complex game might be what will happen, especially if you do have buttons which are hidden and which show if you have unlocked a certain feature. But here I will create a script which is going to be the navigation button script. And I will simply create an exported variable. So I do not like to use export variables on YouTube videos because it's creating a lot of errors for viewers, but I will do it anyway since it is the only solution here. I want the navigation index as an integer to be exported so that we can edit it in the editor. Then we want to create an onPressed behavior. Right away, when we create the on function, we bind it so that we do not forget. Here, we just use the built-in pressed of the button to connect it to onPressed. And what we do when we click on that button is simply call on user interface, get the reference of the singleton, which changed the view and assigned the navigation index. Okay, this script is done. So all we have to do is to go in properties of that button here and set the index correctly. So here it's going to be 0. The second button will take the script as well. So I'm going to drag the script right here and I will assign to it a 1 index. All right. This is what we have now. Let's actually run this scene. What are those things? Let's add the user interface to the game. Okay, so we can run the game and see how this user interface is working. We begin with the view 1 because it's the value that the tab container has within the editor, and we can click the buttons to change to the view 2 and come back to the view 1. That's pretty much it. Here, this is all we will do today. However, I will just foreshadow a little bit what's coming up next, because as you can see, when I click on the buttons here, we do have those white rectangles around it. So again, we talked about this in the previous episode, so you can change this manually for each button. But on the long run, it is something that doesn't work very well. Well, it worked, but it's exhausting. So what we will do is actually leave this like this, and we will talk about how to edit the theme of the game, the skinning of the game, so that when you change the properties of one element, it changes the properties of all the same elements within the game. Alright, this is all for today. I hope you like this episode. I'm not gonna give you any exercise in there because it's just playing with UI. That's the only exercise I can give you. In the next episodes, which come later, I will eventually maybe do a little bit of user interface on my own without showing you every steps on camera, and you will be able to try to replicate those if you want to try that. If you have difficulties replicating those user interface, you can always ask anywhere you want to ask. People will help you, me as well. And yeah, let's not waste too much time on user interface because it's really not the most exciting feature for this series. If you like this video, make sure that you tell YouTube that you did. I'll be going and you practice because this is how you get better at making games.